The child bit him. Not a warning. Not a threat. A full, deliberate clamp of tiny teeth straight into the forearm of a man who had been doing this job for 11 years. Dr. Reginald Okafor yanked his arm back, knocked his glasses off the desk, and stumbled into the wall of the private hospital suite. A room that cost more per night than most people made in a month. 3 small boys stood in the center of it. Identical faces. Identical expressions. Not scared. Not remorseful. Amused. "Get them out," the head of security said from the doorway. His name was Marcus Webb, 6 feet of calm that had been completely unraveling for the past 72 hours. "Get them. Somebody get them out before they take another one." Nobody moved. The 3 boys, Zion, Zaire, and Zaylan Cade, age 6, triplet alpha heirs to one of the most powerful syndicates on the eastern seaboard, stood barefoot in the middle of a $12,000 rug and stared at the adults around them like they were mildly entertained by a failing circus. The lead behavioral specialist hired at $45,000 for the week had quit that morning. The second team sent in as backup had lasted 4 hours. A child psychologist who had published 3 books on managing high-designation children had called for her coat at noon and said, quietly, that she needed air and had not come back. Hi viewers. Have you ever seen a child completely shut down every expert in the room and make them feel like the problem? Drop a yes in the comments if you've ever met a kid like that, because what happens next is going to hit different. Marcus Webb rubbed the bridge of his nose. The triplets had not slept in 2 days. They had not eaten a full meal. They had overturned 2 trays, shredded a certified therapeutic activity kit, and one of them, Zaylan, the quiet one, had somehow gotten hold of a hospital ID badge and slid it under the door of the supply room, locking a nurse inside for 20 minutes. Their father, Alpha King Darius Cade, was in the ICU 2 floors up. Poisoned. Stable but unconscious. The Syndicate was managing the public-facing narrative carefully, but behind the secured floors of Meridian Medical Center, the internal chaos was very real. The boys weren't acting out. They were grieving, in the only language they knew. Marcus got a call at 2:47 in the afternoon. "There's someone in the lobby," his assistant said. "He's been sitting there since this morning. Won't leave. Says he can help with the children." Marcus looked at the boys. Zaire had just picked up an unopened juice box and was considering, very seriously, throwing it at the window. "Send him up," Marcus said. The man who walked in did not look like a specialist. No badge, no clipboard, no lanyard with a certification logo on it. He was lean, quiet, maybe 28. Dark skin, close-cut hair, wearing a plain gray shirt and carrying nothing except a small notebook and a pen. He stopped just inside the doorway, looked at the 3 boys, and didn't flinch. He didn't say hello. He didn't crouch down to their level with that practiced softness that adults used when they were pretending not to be afraid. He just walked to the far corner of the room, sat down on the floor against the wall, opened his notebook, and started writing. One of the security guards actually laughed. "Who is this?" the guard said. Marcus held up a hand. "Wait." The boys stared at the man. He didn't look back. Zion took a step toward him. Then another. Zaire followed. Zaylan, the quiet one, was already halfway across the room before the other 2 had moved. The man in the gray shirt looked up from his notebook. He did not smile. He did not speak. He held the notebook out, written in clean, even letters. "I don't talk. Children listen better that way." The room went completely still. And then, Zaylan Cade, who had not let a single adult touch him in 72 hours, sat down on the floor next to the stranger. Marcus exhaled slowly. The security guard stopped laughing. But before anyone could say a word, before Marcus could even process what he'd just watched, a sharp sound cut through the room. Zion had crossed back to the guard nearest the door and bitten him, clean through the sleeve. The guard yelped. Marcus spun around. The room erupted, and through all of it, the shouting, the scrambling, the medical staff rushing in, the man in the gray shirt didn't move. He sat with Zaylan. He kept writing in his notebook. When Marcus finally looked back at the corner, Zaire had joined them, all 3 boys, sitting around a man no one had hired, no one had vetted, and no one knew anything about. Marcus walked over. The man looked up. He flipped the notebook page and held it out again. 2 words. "He's fine." Marcus stared at him. "Who are you?" The man wrote again. "Kale." Just that. No last name. No title. No explanation. Marcus pulled out his phone and started typing a message to his assistant. "Run a full background check. Now." He looked back at the corner. Zion had come back. All 3 boys were sitting there now, quiet for the first time in 2 days. And Kale, whoever he was, had laid the notebook flat on the floor between them, and Zaire was drawing in it with a pen. Marcus didn't understand what he was watching. But as he turned back toward the door, something made him stop. Because Kale had looked up, and he was watching the hallway. Not anxiously, not curiously, like someone who already knew what was coming. He slowly knelt down in front of Zaylin, the quietest, the most closed off of all 3, and touched 2 fingers lightly to his own wrist. A pulse point, a grounding technique. Zaylin looked down at his own wrist, then back up at Kale. And the child, who had not made a calm sound in 3 days, exhaled. The guard who'd been bitten was still being treated in the hallway. Marcus turned back to the room. Kale was already looking at him. He held the notebook up one more time. "Let me stay tonight. No contract request. No rate negotiation. No credential binder. Just that." Marcus stared at the man for a long moment. Then he nodded. He walked out. He started drafting the security memo. He was halfway down the hall when his phone buzzed. His assistant. The message read, "Background check on subject named Kale. Almost no records found. DOB approximate. No registered syndicate affiliation. Employment history incomplete. Secondary search triggered." Marcus stopped walking. He looked back toward the suite. Then he kept moving because 3 alpha heirs had just fallen asleep for the first time in 72 hours, and he wasn't going to be the person who disturbed that. But something was wrong. He just couldn't name it yet. The boys slept 4 hours. That doesn't sound like much. But for 72 hours of screaming, overturned trays, and 1 behavioral specialist leaving with a bruised ego and a bitten forearm, 4 hours felt like a miracle. Marcus Webb stood in the observation corridor and watched through the glass. Kale was on the floor between the 2 beds. He hadn't asked for a chair, hadn't asked for a cot. He'd taken the blanket a nurse quietly left near the door and folded it twice, set it under him, and stayed there. He wasn't sleeping. He was just present. There's a difference between watching children and being with them. Most adults have forgotten that. Kale hadn't. He sat in a way that said, "I am not going anywhere." Not as a promise. Not as a performance. Just as a fact. Zion's arm was dangling off the edge of the bed. Kale had placed his own hand beneath it. Not holding, not restraining. Just there. So the child's arm had somewhere to land if it slipped. The night nurse made a note. She'd worked pediatrics for 16 years. She'd seen specialists, therapists, high-paid consultants cycle through difficult cases. She'd never seen this. She didn't say anything. She just went back to her station and updated the chart to read. Children sleeping. Stable. Caregiver present. She didn't know what else to call him. By morning, the hospital administrator had made his way to Marcus with 2 things in hand. A contract offer and a check. The contract was generous. 7 days, full access, private room adjacent to the suite, meals covered. The check was pre-signed with a number that made most people say yes before they finished reading. Kale read both. He handed them back. He wrote in his notebook, "Thank you." No. The administrator blinked. "You're refusing payment." Kale wrote again, "I'm not a vendor." "Then what are you?" He didn't write anything else. The administrator left with his contract and his check and a very uncomfortable feeling he couldn't explain. Marcus pulled the administrator aside before he reached the elevator. "Don't push it," he said. "Not yet. He has to sign something. This is a liability issue." "I know." Marcus looked down the hall. "Give me 24 hours. He didn't have a reason he could put in writing. He just knew, the way you know things when you've spent enough time managing crisis. that the moment you pushed this particular person too hard, something was going to break. He didn't know what. He didn't know why. But the boys were asleep. And that was the first true quiet this floor had seen in 3 days. Kale spent the morning using nothing but stillness. He didn't introduce activities, didn't offer options, didn't ask questions. He sat near the window with the notebook in his lap, and one by one, the boys drifted toward him. Zaire brought him a broken crayon, one of the ones that had been scattered across the floor during the previous day's chaos, and set it on the notebook. Kale looked at it. He picked it up. He drew something small in the corner of a page. Zaire leaned in. It was a dog. Loose lines quickly sketched. But Zaire's entire face shifted. He pointed at it, then pointed at himself. Kale turned the notebook toward him and handed over the crayon. Zaire drew next to the dog. It was a terrible circle with legs. But Kale studied it for a full 10 seconds like it was the most important thing he'd seen all week. Zion watched from the bed. By 11, all 3 boys were drawing. No screaming, no throwing, no testing. A hospital staff member stopped in the doorway and stared. She'd been here on Wednesday. Had watched the behavioral specialist get backed into a corner and the security team scrambling. She looked at Kale, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by 3 alpha heirs who were calmly defacing a notebook. And then she looked at Marcus. "What does he do?" she asked. Marcus said, "Apparently nothing." She thought about that. "That's the thing," she said. "That nobody does." The background check came back more complete around midday. Marcus read it twice. There wasn't much. That was the issue. Most people left trails, school records, work history, utility accounts, syndicate registration, medical files. Kale had traces, fragments, a registered address that had been vacant for 3 years, a name that appeared on one document, a transit clearance from a city evacuation that had been sealed after a riot 6 years ago. That was it. For a man who appeared to be roughly 28, 29, that was almost nothing. Marcus forwarded it to the head of Syndicate security with a single note. Escalate if necessary. He didn't say necessary to what. He didn't know yet. By the afternoon, the lead physician on Darius Cade's care team had come down to check on the children. She stood in the observation corridor and watched for a while. She said to Marcus, "Control forces obedience. Safety creates trust. Whatever he's doing, that's the second one." Marcus didn't respond. He was thinking about the sealed evacuation file, and the fact that when he'd asked Kale directly, casually, if he'd ever worked with children before, Kale had just looked at him, written nothing, looked back at the boys, like the question wasn't wrong, just not the right shape. The evening was quieter than the one before. The boys ate, not much but something. Zaylin finished half a bowl of rice. Zion drank his juice. Zaire fell asleep sitting up, and Kale moved him without waking him. Efficiently, carefully, the kind of movement that came from practice, not instinct. Marcus was at his post when Zaylin woke up around 9. The boy sat up slowly. He looked around. He found Kale immediately, the way children find the one fixed point in an unstable room. Then he did something that nobody reported in the official log, because nobody watching understood what it was. Zaylin lifted both hands. He moved them slowly, deliberately, in the silence of the room. Sign language. And Kale's hands moved back. Zaylin looked at him for a long moment. Then he signed again. 3 signs. Slow, clear. "You smell like home." Kale's hands went still. His expression didn't change, but something shifted. Somewhere behind his eyes, something that had been held very carefully in place moved. He looked at the child for a long moment. Then he signed back. One word. Sleep. Zaylin lay back down. And Marcus, who had been watching from the corridor through the glass, felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, because he didn't know sign language. But he'd worked in security long enough to read body language. And what he'd just watched wasn't a stranger calming a child. It was recognition. The secondary background search was still running. It came back at 11:47 p.m. One line flagged. Subject name cross-referenced against sealed Syndicate juvenile files. Connection. Rival territory. Eastern boundary. 6 years prior. Marcus stared at the screen. He looked up at the sweet camera feed. Kale was sitting in the dark. Still, eyes open. The boys asleep around him. Marcus picked up his phone. He didn't call yet, but he was thinking about it. The ICU had a rule. Family only. No exceptions. No visitors without clearance from the attending physician and written authorization from the Syndicate's medical liaison. The triplets were family. But children under 8 weren't permitted in ICU without written exception. Marcus Webb filed the exception at 6 a.m. It was approved by 7. Not because the protocol said yes. Because the attending physician had watched 3 behavioral teams fail, had read the overnight nurse's report on the boys eating and sleeping for the first time in 3 days, and had made a call that wasn't entirely by the book. She told the liaison, "Their nervous systems need anchor. The most logical anchor is their father. We give them access." The liaison said, "And the caregiver?" She said, "He comes with them or we don't go." Marcus escorted them himself. The elevator ride was quiet. Zion stood against the wall. Zaire held his own wrist. Not Cael's, not Marcus's. His own. Like he was reminding himself he was solid. Zaylin was looking at the floor numbers change. Kale stood slightly behind them. He wasn't managing them. He wasn't directing. He was just there, behind, the way a current runs under still water. The ICU doors opened. The boys saw their father. Darius Cade was unconscious, surrounded by monitors, wires crossing his chest in a pattern that looked nothing like the man who commanded rooms without raising his voice. He was smaller on that bed. That was the thing that hit hardest. The most powerful alpha in 4 territories looked small in that bed. Zion made a sound. One short, sharp intake of breath. Zaire gripped his own wrist tighter. Zaylin didn't move. Kale stepped forward. Slowly. He moved to the side of the bed. He looked at the boys and then at their father. He looked back at Zion. He held open his arms. Not coaxing. Not asking. Just available. Zion crossed the room in 3 steps. Kale lifted him, adjusted his weight, and held him so the boy was facing his father. Close enough to see him. Close enough to touch if he wanted. But not dropped into something overwhelming. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Then Kale did something that made the attending physician look up from her chart. He settled Zion against the right side of his own chest. Not against the bed rail, not hovering. And he placed Zion's small hand flat on his father's forearm. Skin contact. Warmth. Connection. The heart monitor, steady before normal, gave 1 spike. Just 1. Then settled again. The physician looked at the readout. She looked at Kale. He wasn't watching the monitor. He was watching Zion. Zaire moved to the other side of the bed on his own. He found a space near his father's hand. He sat on the edge of the visitor chair and put his chin on the rail. Zaylin came last. He stood at the foot of the bed. Kale looked at him. He signed something fast, small. Zaylin signed back. Then he walked to the chair beside Kale, climbed up without help, and leaned so his shoulder was pressed against Kale's arm. The room was absolutely still. The physician wrote 1 word in her notes. Coincidence. She wasn't sure she believed it. Down the hall, in the conference room that had been converted into a temporary Syndicate command center, 3 men in suits were watching the ICU feed on a security tablet. The oldest of them, Devonte Sims, was head of Syndicate finance. He had a mind like a locked vault and the patience of someone who had spent 40 years managing powerful people's money. He did not like unknowns. He did not like things he couldn't put a number on. He watched Kale settle the boys. He watched the heart monitor spike. He watched Zaylin sign and Kale sign back. He put the tablet face down on the table. "He's influencing those children," he said. The man to his left, a younger executive named Patrice Osei, said, "In a good way, though." Devonte looked at him. Patrice stopped talking. "It's not about good or bad," Devonte said. "It's about authorized. He is not authorized. He has no contract, no clearance, no verified background, and no Syndicate affiliation we can confirm. He is in an ICU with the Alpha's children. That is a problem. He turned to the third man at the table. Draft a contract. Make it mandatory. He already refused one. Then make this one non-negotiable. The third man left the room. Back in the ICU, none of that was visible. The world on this side of those doors was monitors and light and three boys pressed close to a father who couldn't yet feel them there. Kale sat on the floor near the foot of the bed. He opened his notebook. He wrote something. He closed it. The boys stayed for 40 minutes. Longer than the physician expected. Longer than Marcus had been authorized for. But no one came to end it. When they finally left, Zion kept looking back over his shoulder. Zaire held the elevator door long past when it tried to close. Zaylin signed one thing to Kale as they walked back down the hall. He comes back? Kale thought about it for exactly 1 second, then signed yes. He didn't know if that was true. He signed it anyway. That evening, a courier arrived at the suite with an envelope. Inside was a contract. For pages. Non-negotiable language across every paragraph. A payment figure that made the first offer look modest. A clause that said the caregiver agreed to complete background disclosure as a condition of continued access. Kale read all 4 pages. He took his pen. He turned to the signature line. And he wrote, in the same clean, even letters he'd used since the day he walked in, no. He handed the envelope back to the courier. And went back to the boys. For exactly 48 hours, everything looked fine. That was the trick. The world stabilized, or at least it looked that way from the outside. The boys were calm. The floor was quiet. The hospital press liaison had successfully redirected every media question about the Alpha's health into a careful narrative about a planned medical procedure and rest period. Nobody bought it completely, but nobody had anything better. The Syndicate's public-facing communications team called it a controlled situation. Devonte Sims, sitting in the conference room with 4 screens open, said nothing. He didn't call it anything. He just watched. But the relief in the hallways was real. The nurses stopped walking with their shoulders up near their ears. Marcus Webb actually sat down for 20 minutes. The pediatric floor that had been quietly dreading every morning for the past 5 days started to feel like an ordinary hospital floor again. The triplets ate breakfast. A real one. Zaire finished his eggs. Zion drank orange juice and tried to convince Kale to let him have a second one. And Kale looked at him for a long moment and wrote one word in the notebook. Water. Zion made a face that could have powered a Broadway production. Kale didn't change his answer. And this was the part that made Marcus stop in the doorway and just stare. Zion drank the water. No screaming. No throwing. No negotiation team required. Just a mute man with a notebook and an unimpressed expression. Patrice Osei, who had been hovering near the suite most of the morning like a man trying to look casual while counting every detail, leaned over to Marcus and said, "How?" Marcus said, "I don't know. He's not doing anything. I know. That's the thing that's working." Marcus didn't respond. He'd been thinking about the sealed file, the riot evacuation, the 6-year-old clearance record that connected a name to a territory that was not this one. He'd been thinking about it every hour since the secondary search came back, and he hadn't told anyone yet. Not because he was protecting Kale, but because he wasn't sure what it meant. And Marcus Webb did not move on information he couldn't interpret. The formal announcement came from Syndicate leadership at noon. Kale was designated temporary guardian of the Cade triplets for the duration of Alpha Cade's medical recovery. The language was careful, temporary, supervised, contingent on ongoing review. No contract signed. No background disclosure completed. Those gaps were noted internally and flagged, but set aside. Because the alternative was another behavioral team. Another failure. Another 72 hours of chaos. And nobody wanted that. The boys reacted to the announcement in a way nobody had anticipated. They didn't react at all. Because to them, nothing had changed. This person had been theirs since the moment he sat down on the floor. The Syndicate putting words on paper about it was irrelevant. They hadn't asked for permission. Zion sat next to Kale that afternoon and watched him write in the notebook and asked, Through a series of gestures, none of which were formal sign language, just things the two of them had apparently developed in the past 48 hours, if he could write something too. Kale handed over the notebook. Zion drew a house. He handed it back. Kale looked at it. He drew something next to it. A door, slightly open. Zion studied it for a long time. Then he nodded like that was exactly correct. The executives who came through that afternoon to conduct their routine wellness check, which everyone understood was actually a welfare surveillance visit, walked in expecting to feel relieved. What they found instead was something that made three separate people in suits quietly uncomfortable. Belonging. The boys moved around this stranger like he was load-bearing, like removing him would cause something structural to collapse. One executive, a woman named Clarice Beaumont who oversaw child protection policy for the Syndicate, stood in the corner for 10 minutes. She watched Zaylin sign something to Kale. She watched Kale sign back. She watched Zaire climb into Kale's lap without asking and open a picture book while Kale kept writing in the notebook with his other hand. Just existing, unhurried, like this was not an unusual thing. She walked out and found Marcus in the hall. "How long has he known sign language?" she asked. Marcus said, "Unknown. How does a 6-year-old, one of ours, know sign language?" Marcus said, "The boy's father." She looked at him. "Darius Cade knows sign language?" she asked. Marcus said, "Unknown." She left without saying anything else. But she sent a message from the elevator, short 2 sentences, to Devonte Sims. He read it. He pulled up the background investigation file. He forwarded the escalation flag he'd been sitting on since yesterday. The senior investigative team had 48 hours. He told them 40. Back in the suite, the afternoon continued quietly. Zaire fell asleep in Kale's lap. Zion was on the floor with the notebook. Zaylin was sitting on the windowsill, watching the city below. Kale looked at each of them, one by one. His expression was unreadable, but his hands had gone still, the pen resting flat across the notebook page. He was thinking about something. Whatever it was, it pulled his gaze to the door. The hallway, the elevator bank. He looked away. He picked up the pen. He started writing again. Marcus came in at 4 p.m. with a tablet, the updated investigative summary. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the scene. Then he looked down at the screen. The line the investigative team had flagged was short. Caregiver identified on sealed transit record from Eastern Border riot, 6 years prior. Territory classification, rival. File cross-matched against biometric partial from Meridian Hospital intake log. Confidence level, 87%. Marcus looked up. Kale was looking at him. Not nervously, not guiltily, just steady, even, like a man who had been waiting for a particular door to open. Marcus held the tablet slightly behind his back. He said, "I need to ask you something." Kale picked up the notebook. He waited. Marcus said, "Where were you 6 years ago?" The room was very quiet. Zaire was still asleep. Zion had looked up from the floor. Zaylin had turned from the window. Kale looked at the notebook. He didn't write anything. He just looked at Marcus. And then, slowly, he set the notebook face down on the chair beside him and said nothing, which, from a man who never said anything, meant everything. They put cameras in the stairwells that night. Marcus didn't announce it. He added 3 posts to the corridor rotation, shortened the check-in window from 90 minutes to 45, and quietly requested that the floor's secondary access be restricted to essential personnel only. He didn't tell Kale, but Kale noticed. The way he always noticed things, without reacting, without adjusting, without letting his face say anything that his hands weren't already saying in sign. He saw the new camera angle reflected in the window glass at 6 a.m. when he was awake and the boys were not yet. He cataloged the shift change timing. He registered the new face in the corridor who was trying very hard to look like part of the regular rotation. He picked up his notebook. He wrote, "Good morning," and flipped the page. That was it. Zion woke up and immediately tried to steal Kale's pen. A full 4-minute campaign involving strategic distraction, 1 fake coughing fit, and an attempt to climb Kale from behind like a tree. He failed. Kale didn't look up from the page. Zion sat down beside him, arms crossed, deeply betrayed. Kale tore a page from the back of the notebook, handed Zion the stolen pen back. He'd had a second one the whole time, and watched the boy's face go through 5 emotions in 4 seconds. Zaire laughed from the bed. Even Zaylin, from his windowsill position, turned away quickly to hide something that might have been a smile. The morning looked fine, but underneath the fine something was moving. 3 floors down and 1 conference room over, Devonte Sims was on his second phone call of the morning. He was speaking with someone whose name Marcus had never been told. Someone in the Syndicate's external intelligence structure, a position that didn't appear on organizational charts. They were discussing Kale. They were discussing the rival territory designation, the sealed file, the absence of records that should exist for any person living a conventional life. Could be witness protection, the voice said. Could be, Devonte said. Could be placement. Yes. A pause. What does he want? Devonte looked at the security feed. The suite, the boys, Kale on the floor with the notebook. Nothing, he said. That's the problem. He's asked for nothing. And that is not a pattern I trust. Upstairs, Clarice Beaumont was compiling her welfare report. She was good at this, 22 years in child protection, a mind that filed every detail and held it until a pattern emerged. She'd been watching the footage. She'd been reading the nurse logs. She had a profile forming, and she didn't know what to do with it yet. Because the profile said, "This person is safe for these children. His methods are sound, his consistency is stable, his behavioral reads are accurate in ways most credentialed professionals aren't." But the administrative profile said, "Unknown origin, rival territory, no verifiable history, refused all documentation, 2 true things, pointing in opposite directions." She wrote both in her report and submitted it to Sims because that was her job. To report what she saw, not to resolve the contradiction. Devonte read it. He made a call. By noon, the quiet removal plan had a shape. Not aggressive. Nothing that would disrupt the boys again. Clarice had been very clear in her report that behavioral regression was a genuine risk, and Sims was nothing if not strategic. He didn't want chaos. He wanted control. The plan was simple. Cite security protocol, cite the incomplete background clearance, cite the unsigned contract, all of which were real, legitimate administrative issues, and reassign the caregiver to a secondary care facility under review. Give it a week. Let the boys adjust. Bring in a team that was properly vetted. He'd done harder things. He signed the authorization. Preliminary. Pending one final review. In the suite, none of that existed yet. Kale was sitting with Zaylin near the window. They were signing back and forth. Not frantically. Slow, almost lazy, the pace of people who have built their own private language over time. Patrice Osei watched from the corridor. He'd been standing there for 10 minutes, pretending to be on his phone. He was actually thinking. He'd been in this syndicate 12 years. He knew how it moved. He knew Devonte's patterns, Clarice's caution, the way decisions got made in rooms where the people most affected weren't present. He thought about the past 72 hours. He thought about the boys before Kale. 3 days of it, the screaming, the biting, the regression, the $45,000 failure. He thought about Zaire sleeping in someone's lap without being asked. He put his phone in his pocket. He did not make the call he'd been considering. Instead, he went back to the conference room and said nothing. Devonte looked at him. Patrice said, "You're about to do something that breaks those kids again." Devonte said, "I'm going to do something that protects them." From what? From a man no one knows anything about, who has more access and emotional influence over the Alpha's heirs than anyone authorized. Patrice thought about that. Or, he said carefully, he's the one person who actually helped. Devonte picked up the signed authorization. He didn't say anything else. Patrice left. The afternoon passed slowly. Kale took the boys to the small courtyard on the hospital's 3rd floor. A permission Marcus had approved that morning without thinking too hard about it, because the boys needed air and they wouldn't go without Kale, and that had seemed like the simplest solution. They stayed 40 minutes. Zion found a beetle and required a 10-minute consultation about whether it should live in the notebook. Kale considered this seriously. He wrote, "Outside." Zion protested. Kale wrote, "Outside." Zion gave the beetle a very formal farewell. Zaire ran figure eights around a planter until he was dizzy. Zaylin sat beside Kale and held his wrist, not holding on, just touching the pulse point, like he'd learned it from watching Kale that first night and decided it belonged to him too. The Syndicate's attachment. You didn't authorize. By the time they came back inside, the preliminary removal authorization had been sent to the medical liaison for final signature. Kale didn't know. The boys didn't know. Marcus knew. He sat at his post with it printed in front of him, and he thought about the woman who'd said it best. Control forces obedience. Safety creates trust. He thought about what happens when you remove safety because you can't prove where it came from. He folded the paper. He put it in his jacket pocket. He was still deciding. The evening update came at 8 p.m. 2 floors up, Darius Cade's attending physician recorded a change in status. His neural response scores had improved overnight by a margin that was ahead of projections. She noted it in the chart. She did not use the word unexpected. She used the word encouraging. And at 9:47 p.m., while 3 boys were asleep in a room guarded by a man no one could fully account for, the physician looked at the monitor and said nothing, because the monitor, steady all day, had just shifted. Not dangerously, not urgently. One deliberate, visible change, like something waking up. She pressed the call button. She picked up her chart. And across the nurse's station screen, in green text, 2 words updated. Patient status, responsive. Darius Cade was coming back. And nobody in that hospital. Not Marcus, not Devante, not the removal authorization sitting folded in a jacket pocket, was ready for what that meant. The monitor didn't lie. That was the first thing the attending physician said when she walked into the ICU at 9:52 p.m. and looked at the readout herself. Not a relay, not a nurse's verbal update, but the actual screen, the actual numbers, the actual pattern of a brain pulling itself back toward the surface. "He's responsive," she said. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way doctors say things when they've been in medicine long enough to know that loud and dramatic belong in waiting rooms, not ICUs. Responsive meant eyes open within the next 12 hours. It meant command response possible within 24. It meant Darius Cade, Alpha King, poisoned and unconscious for 5 days, was coming back. 2 floors down, nobody had been told yet. Kale was sitting with his back against the wall between the 2 beds. Zion was on his left side, one small foot pressed against Kale's knee in sleep. Not accidental, deliberate, the way children anchor themselves to the one fixed thing in an uncertain room. Zaire had his arm over his face, the way he always slept, blocking out the world. Zaylin was on his back, hands folded on his chest like a small, serious effigy. All 3 breathing slow, all 3 safe. Kale had the notebook open but hadn't written in it for 40 minutes. He was watching the door. Not the way someone watches a door because they're afraid of what's on the other side. The way someone watches a door because they've been expecting it to open for a long time. Marcus came in at 10:11 p.m. He didn't knock. He cracked the door, saw Kale awake, and held up 2 fingers, his shorthand for come to the hallway. Kale looked at the boys. He stood slowly, making sure the shift in weight didn't wake anyone. Zion's foot found the floor without waking him. Zaire didn't move. Zaylin opened his eyes. He looked at Kale. Kale signed, "Here. Back soon." Zaylin looked at the door, then at Kale again. Then he closed his eyes. In the hallway, Marcus kept his voice low. "Cade's responsive. They'll be setting up for a possible waking within the next day. Physician wants the boys present during the transition window, something about neural calming response." Kale wrote, "When?" "Morning. Earliest." Kale wrote, "All 3. "Yes." Marcus looked at him. "And you?" Kale didn't write anything. He looked down the hallway toward the elevator bank, toward the floors above them. Marcus said, "There's something else." Kale waited. Devonte Sims signed a preliminary removal authorization this afternoon. It hasn't been finalized. I've been sitting on it. A pause. Kale looked at him. His expression did not change. Not tightening, not flinching. Not the thing most people do when they hear that someone in power has decided to move them. He picked up the notebook. He wrote one sentence. Did you finalize it? Marcus said. No. Kale wrote. Then what are you telling me for? Marcus stared at him. Kale put the notebook under his arm. He turned back toward the suite door. Marcus said, because you should know what's coming. People in your position. Kale stopped. He turned back around. He held the notebook up. He wrote slowly, deliberately, the words larger than usual. What position is that? Marcus didn't answer. Kale went back inside. The rest of the night passed in the particular stillness that hospital floors reach around 2 a.m. When the overhead lights dim to their night setting and the corridor sounds drop to footsteps and the soft mechanical rhythm of equipment. The world outside a hospital at 2 a.m. feels suspended. Like the city agreed just for a few hours to hold its breath. Kale did not sleep. He'd learned a long time ago that sleeping when he should be awake was a trade he couldn't afford. He sat. He watched. He thought through things in the ordered, methodical way he approached most problems. Not linearly, not from the beginning, but from the point of highest pressure outward. The highest pressure point right now was tomorrow morning. The second highest was Devonte Sims. The third, and he was honest with himself about this, was the man upstairs who was waking up. Because Kale had been managing the distance between himself and that man with precision for 5 days. He'd stood in the ICU. He'd placed those children against their father's arm and felt the heart monitor spike and told himself it was about the boys. He told himself that again now, in the dark. He was still telling himself that when Zion rolled over in his sleep and flung one arm sideways and it landed across Kale's knee. Kale looked at the small hand on his knee. He picked up the notebook. He held the pen for a moment. He didn't write anything. He just sat there with the pen in his hand and the small hand on his knee and the weight of a waking man 2 floors above him pressing on the room like weather. The morning came anyway. It always did. They went upstairs at 7:15 a.m. The physician met them at the ICU doors. She was brief, practical. She'd prepped the boys as much as you could prep 6-year-olds for complexity, which was to say she'd said, your dad is waking up and it'll be slow and he might not say much but he can hear you. Zion had said, can he hear Kale? The physician had looked at Marcus. Marcus had looked at Kale. Kale had written, let's go. Inside the ICU, the atmosphere had shifted from the last time. Before, Darius had been unreachable. Present only as a body, a chest rising and falling, a frequency the boys responded to without understanding why. Now there was something different in the room. A weight, an attention. The monitor still tracking everything, but behind the closed eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Awareness. The boys knew. Children always know. Zion went directly to the bed. He put both hands on the rail. He leaned in close, the way he'd watched Kale do it, and said quietly, we're here, Dad. The monitor didn't spike this time. It steadied, like something that had been slightly off pitch finding its note. Zaire stood at the foot of the bed and held his own wrist. Present. Counted for. Zaylen signed something no one else caught. Kale caught it. His hands moved back, briefly. And then, at 7:34 a.m., 41 seconds into a silence that felt like its own full conversation, Darius Cade's eyes opened. Not all the way. A fraction. A crack of dark eyes under heavy lids. But open. The physician stepped forward. She said his name. She asked him to track her finger if he could. He didn't track the finger. His eyes moved past her, past the boys, landed on the corner of the room, on Kale. The physician wrote in her chart, patient opened eyes at 7:34 a.m., tracked toward movement in the room, asked standard response questions. Limited verbal response, 1 word only. She didn't include the word in the chart. But it was who. He'd looked at Kale and said who. Not to the boys. Not to the physician. Not to the security team that had been waiting for this moment for 5 days. To the man standing quietly in the corner, holding a notebook, wearing a gray shirt, with 3 small boys orbiting him like planets. Who? Marcus, standing at the door, felt something cold settle across his shoulders. He took out his phone. He forwarded the removal authorization to Devante Sims's office with one added note. Hold. Pending direct alpha review. He didn't know if that would work. He didn't know if he had the authority. He sent it anyway. Back inside, the physician was talking Darius through the basics, where he was, how long, what happened. His responses were limited. A nod, a slow blink, the occasional word that came out rougher than he probably meant it, scrubbed by 5 days of sedation and a poisoning that had hit his system hard. But his eyes kept moving. Back to the corner. Back to the man in the gray shirt. The boys noticed. Zion looked at Kale, then at his dad. Then at Kale again. He tugged Kale's sleeve. Kale looked down. Zion pointed at his father, then at Kale, then made a motion with his hand that meant, in the small private language they'd built, "Come here." Kale shook his head slightly. Zion did it again. Kale looked at the physician. She gave a small nod. He crossed the room. He stood at the side of the bed, close enough to be visible, far enough to be appropriate. Darius Cade's dark eyes tracked him the whole way. Then, very slowly, with the effort of someone rebuilding basic function from scratch, stayed. Not a question. Not exactly a statement. Somewhere between them. Kale looked at him. He reached for the notebook. He wrote one line. He held it where Darius could read it. The boys stayed. I just sat with them. Darius read it. His eyes closed again. But before they did, something crossed his face that the physician didn't chart, and Marcus, watching through the glass, couldn't quite name. Recognition. Not of a stranger. Something older than that. And then his eyes were closed, and the monitors were steady, and the boys were pressed close, and Kale was standing at the side of the bed with his notebook and the pen and a face that showed nothing. Nothing except the grip on the pen, which was slightly too tight. Just slightly. If anyone had been looking at his hands, they would have seen it. Nobody was looking at his hands. The order came on a Tuesday. Not with shouting. Not with security teams or raised voices or anything that looked like what it actually was. Came as paperwork. 3 pages, formal letterhead, Syndicate seal in the upper left corner. Words like reassignment and transitional protocol and administrative review period. Clean words for a brutal thing. Marcus brought it to the suite himself because he wasn't willing to let someone else do it. He stood in the doorway and held the papers and looked at the room. Zion on the floor, Zaire at the small table they'd moved in, Zaylin at the window, Kale on the chair near the center, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he said, "The council voted this morning." Kale looked up. Darius isn't cleared for executive decisions yet. Medically, his voice is limited, his mobility's restricted, and the council invoked the provisional authority clause. They've had that ability since the poisoning. They just waited until he was stable enough that it didn't look. Marcus stopped. He tried again. They moved while he was awake enough to not be critical and not awake enough to stop them. Kale set the notebook down on the chair arm. He looked at Marcus. Not angry, not panicked, just waiting, the way he always waited, like a person who had stood in the middle of difficult things before and learned that the first 60 seconds don't require a reaction. Marcus held out the papers. "You're being reassigned to a secondary care facility across town. The boys stay here. A certified team arrives Thursday." The room was very quiet. Then Zion said, "No." Just that. One word. The clearest, hardest, most certain thing a 6-year-old had ever said in that room. Zaire looked up from the table. Zaylin turned from the window. All 3 of them were looking at Marcus. And in the look was something that no certified team, no policy decision, no provisional authority clause had prepared him for. They knew. Children always know. Kale picked the notebook back up. He wrote slowly. He turned it toward Marcus. "When do I leave?" Marcus said, "Today. By 4. Kale wrote, "The boys? They stay." Another pause. Kale wrote. Who explained it to them? Marcus opened his mouth. Closed it. That's for the team to. Kale wrote. Who explained it to them? Before 4 o'clock, Marcus looked at the 3 boys, all of them still watching him. He said, I can try to. Kale was already writing. He turned the notebook toward the boys. All 3 of them leaned in. He'd written it big, clean letters, simple words, the kind you use when you need something to land without confusion. He's gonna talk to you. Listen to him. Okay. Zion looked at the notebook, then at Kale. His jaw set. You're leaving. Kale looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote, for now. Zion said, that means yes. Kale didn't write anything else. What followed was the hardest 40 minutes of the week. Harder than the first 3 days. Harder than the ICU. Because a child in crisis is chaotic and loud and present. You can manage it, you can respond, you can move. But a child who understands something is being taken from them and has no power to stop it goes somewhere else entirely. Goes somewhere quiet and gray and unreachable. Zion didn't scream. He sat down on the floor against the wall and pulled his knees to his chest and stopped talking. Zaire knocked the table. Not flipped it, knocked it. One hard sideways shove, and then he sat down on the floor too. Back against the bed frame. Eyes on the middle distance. Zaylin didn't move from the window, but he stopped signing. He just stopped. Mid-sentence, mid-conversation, whatever had been between him and whatever world he built in the glass and the sky outside, he stopped. And the stillness in him became a different kind of stillness. Not calm. Not peace. Gone. Kale packed a bag that took 4 minutes. He didn't have much. The notebook. A second pen. A change of clothes from a bag he'd never fully unpacked. He stood at the door for a moment and looked at all 3 boys. He signed something to Zaylin. Zaylin didn't look at him. He tried again. Nothing. He looked at Zion. He walked over. He crouched down and put 2 fingers on his own wrist. The pulse point, the one he'd shown Zaylin on the first night, the grounding technique that had passed between them like a language. Zion looked at his wrist. He looked at Kale. He did not do it back. He turned his face to the wall. Kale stood. He walked out. Marcus followed him to the elevator. They stood in silence. The doors opened. Marcus said, I'm sorry. Kale stepped in. The doors closed. On the floor behind them, in a room that had been quiet for 5 days, a sound started. Not screaming, crying. Low, exhausted, 3-part crying, the kind that has nowhere to go and no logic behind it. Just loss, pure and blunt and enormous in a small body. The nurse at the station heard it. She picked up her phone. She put it back down. She walked to the supply cabinet and stood there for a moment with both palms flat against the cool metal door. And she thought about 14 years and all the things she'd seen. And she thought, there is nothing in this cabinet that fixes this. She was right. By Thursday, the behavioral regression had been documented by 2 physicians, 1 psychologist, and the new care team, who lasted until Friday morning and had already sent a formal request for additional support. Zion was not speaking. Zaire had stopped eating more than token amounts. Zaylin had still not signed a single word since Kale walked out. The night terrors started Wednesday. Zion, 2 a.m. A sound that brought 3 nurses into the room simultaneously. Zaire at 4 a.m. Sitting straight up in bed and staring at the door like he was looking for someone he already knew wasn't there. Zaylin did not have night terrors. Zaylin simply did not sleep. He sat at the window. All night, every night, watching the city below, looking for something. The physician filed an incident report Friday morning that reached Devonte Sims's desk before 9 a.m. It was thorough and clinical and used language like acute attachment disruption and environmental dysregulation, and it ended with 1 sentence that Devonte read 3 times. Recommendation: immediate review of current care assignment with particular attention to the impact of recent caregiver transition. He put the report in a folder. He put the folder in his drawer. He closed the drawer. 3 floors up, Darius Cade's recovery was progressing steadily. His voice was returning. Hoarser than it had been, lower, a texture to it like something that had been burned and hadn't fully healed. But present. He was speaking in short sentences. He was sitting up. The physician was cautiously optimistic. And on Friday afternoon, for the first time since waking, he asked to see the children. They brought the boys to his room. They came in quietly, without the coordination they'd had before. Zion walked with his arms at his sides. Zaire stayed close to the door. Zaylin went directly to the far corner of the room and sat against the wall. Darius watched them. He'd been told, in careful diplomatic language, that a caregiver reassignment had been made for security reasons. He'd been told the boys had experienced a brief adjustment period. He'd been told things were stable. He looked at his 3 sons. He looked at the corner where Zaylin was sitting with his back against the wall and his eyes on the floor. He said, with the rough, rebuilt version of his voice, "Where's the one who stayed?" The nurse who was charting in the corner looked up. The liaison standing near the door looked at his phone. Zion, for the first time in 4 days, made eye contact with another person. He looked directly at his father. He said, "They took him." The room was very still. Darius said, "Who took him?" Zion said, "The people who make decisions." Darius looked at his sons for a long moment. Zaire by the door. Zaylin in the corner. Zion standing in the middle of the room with that set jaw and that devastated look that a 6-year-old should not know how to wear. He picked up the call button. He pressed it. The nurse came immediately. He said, "Get me Marcus Webb." She said, "Sir, your recovery protocol suggests minimal." He said, "Get me Marcus Webb." She went. And in the silence that followed, Zaylin looked up from the floor for the first time. Not at the door. Not at the window. At his father. And he signed, slow, careful, the first words he'd used since Wednesday. "Bring him back." Darius looked at his son. He signed back. 2 words. Careful. Like a man rebuilding a language along with his voice. "I know." Marcus Webb had kept the file for 6 years. Not physically. Not a paper in a drawer or a folder in a filing cabinet. In the way that career intelligence people keep things, in the part of the mind reserved for unresolved patterns. The riot. The sealed evacuation file. The transit clearance that had one name on it connected to nothing before and nothing after. The way a thread hangs off a garment and you don't pull it because you don't know yet what it's attached to. Darius Cade made the call on Friday afternoon. Marcus had it in his hand before 5. He said, "You want me to investigate the caregiver?" Darius said, slowly, the rough voice still rebuilding itself. "I want to know who he is. We already ran a background. I know what you ran." A pause, the length of someone gathering breath or gathering patience. "I want to know who he actually is. Not what the system says. What you find when you go around the system." Marcus said, "That could take time." Darius said, "Then start now." The authorization to override the council's removal order came 4 hours later. Kale was not brought back yet. The authorization suspended the removal, it didn't reverse it. Darius was not strong enough yet to override the council's full provisional authority, and Devonte Sims had 4 lawyers who would argue that point until the walls fell. But the suspension meant Cael's reassignment was in administrative limbo. He was no longer at the secondary facility. He was in a private room on the hospital's extended care floor, brought back on a technicality. Background investigation incomplete, reassignment therefore under review. That Marcus had found in the fine print of the original removal order and used like a crowbar. Cael did not ask questions. He was given a room. He sat in it. He opened the notebook. He waited. Marcus started the real investigation on Saturday morning. He had 3 sources and he used all of them. The first was the sealed evacuation file, the same partial record that had flagged Cael to arrival territory. He'd looked at the surface before. This time he went deeper. He requested full unsealing through a legal process that took most of Saturday and part of Sunday. He got a partial release Sunday evening. A transit log, a biometric partial, and one attached incident report from the riot response. The riot had been 6 years ago. Eastern Boundary Territory, not Cades. A Syndicate summit that had collapsed violently when an internal faction made a play for leadership. The building had come down in sections. Emergency evacuation, mass casualty event, multiple Syndicate figures in the building at the time, including a young alpha heir who was not supposed to be there. Marcus read that line twice. He pulled the attendee list. He cross-referenced it with internal Syndicate records from 6 years ago. Records he'd had to go through a contact at a different organization to access. Records that existed in the gray zone between official and unofficial. The young alpha heir was listed under a transport credential that had been immediately sealed after the event. The credential number matched Darius Cade's secondary identification, the one he used when he traveled without full security. He'd been in that building, 23 years old, in a building that came down during a faction riot, with a security team that had been separated from him in the initial chaos. Marcus sat with that for a moment. Then he went back to the evacuation file. The biometric partial, a scan pulled from transit footage at the emergency exit, showed one figure carrying another. The figure being carried matched Cade's build. The figure doing the carrying was smaller, moving fast, not panicked, deliberate. The way people move when they've decided exactly what they're doing and chaos is just the background noise. The image quality was poor. 6 years old, riot conditions, a camera system that had been partially damaged in the collapse. But the build was clear. The age range was consistent with late 20s, early 30s now. And there was one more thing. In the transit clearance, the single piece of paperwork that connected this person to the evacuation, the one document they'd left behind, there was a secondary field. Optional. Most people skipped it. This person had filled it in. Reason for transit clearance. Medical. It wasn't explaining why they needed to leave. It was explaining why the person they were carrying needed to leave. Marcus read the attached notation. Casualty. Vocal tract trauma from smoke inhalation and structural impact. Carrier indicated subject required immediate medical transport and declined personal documentation at time of processing. He read the last sentence 3 times. Carrier declined personal documentation. He'd saved someone, carried them out of a collapsing building, and refused to give his name. Marcus put the file flat on the desk in front of him. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he pulled the hospital intake scan from Cael's first night in the building. The one taken automatically at the front desk when Marcus's assistant had processed him into the system. Just a face scan routine. He ran the biometric comparison. Took 11 minutes. The result came back at 87%. The same figure the preliminary check had thrown. But now Marcus had something to run it against. The evacuation footage partial, cross-referenced at a higher resolution setting. The system recalculated. 94%. He looked at the screen. He looked at the file. He looked at the evacuation footage still on the second monitor, the grainy image of someone carrying a man out of a building, refusing to give a name, refusing to be documented, disappearing into the transit system and never resurfacing. 6 years. He picked up the phone. He called Darius Cade's room directly, bypassing the nursing station. Darius answered on the second ring. The rough voice. Present, alert. Marcus said, "I found something." A pause. "Come up." Marcus gathered the files. He printed what he needed. He walked to the elevator and rode it up 2 floors and stood outside the ICU-adjacent room where Darius was now recovering, and he thought about what he was walking in with. Not just a background investigation. A history. He knocked. He walked in. Darius was sitting up in the bed, both hands flat on the covers, looking at the door. He'd been doing that, looking at the door since he woke up, like a man who'd been waiting for the right person to come through it. Marcus set the file on the bedside tray. He didn't open it. He said, 6 years ago, Eastern Boundary Riot, Summit Building Collapse. Darius said nothing. You were in the building. Still nothing. But the quality of the silence changed. Someone carried you out, Marcus said. Small build. Fast. Refused documentation. Disappeared after the transit clearance. The room was absolutely quiet. Marcus said, "It was Kale." He opened the file. He turned it so Darius could see the biometric comparison. The evacuation footage frame. The transit clearance with the notation at the bottom. Darius looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. His jaw tightened. A muscle along the side of his face controlled. "But there," he said, quietly, with the rough rebuilt voice that had cost something to put back together. His voice. Marcus said, "What?" "The notation. Vocal tract trauma." Darius looked up. "That's why he doesn't speak." Marcus looked at the file. He looked back at Darius. He'd read the notation. He'd read it as belonging to the person being carried. To Darius. He picked it up. He read it again. Carrier declined personal documentation. Casualty. Vocal tract trauma from smoke inhalation and structural impact. He read the structure of the sentence again. Casualty. Not subject. Not person being transported. Casualty. The casualty was the carrier. "He carried you out," Marcus said slowly. "And he was the one who got hurt," Darius said. "He went back in for someone else." The words landed like something heavy on a flat surface. Marcus looked at him. "The documentation," Darius said. "Why would his vocal tract?" He stopped. He breathed. He tried again carefully, the voice still rough. "He went back in. After getting me out. That's the only way." Marcus looked at the file. He thought about a man who disappeared for 6 years. A man with almost no records. A man who showed up to care for 3 children without being hired, without asking for payment, without offering an explanation. He thought about the sign language. About Zaylin pressing a finger to a pulse point at 2 a.m. About a notebook page that said, "I don't talk. Children listen better that way." He thought about a man who went back into a collapsing building and came out without a voice and never told anyone who he'd saved. He set the file down on the tray. He said, "What do you want to do?" Darius looked at the window. A long pause. The monitor beside him tracking steady. He said, "Bring him to me." They did not bring Kale through the formal channels. No security escort. No formal notification. Marcus went himself, walked to the extended care floor, knocked on the door of the small room they'd put Kale in 3 days ago when the suspension came through. Kale opened the door. He looked at Marcus. Marcus said, "Darius wants to see you." Kale did not look surprised. He did not look relieved. He picked up his notebook from the small table, tucked the pen into the spiral, and stepped into the hallway like a man who had been ready for this and was not particularly excited about it. They rode the elevator in silence, which, with Kale, was regular. But this silence had a different shape than normal. The door to Darius's room was open. Marcus stopped outside. "I'll be here," he said. "Take as long as you need." Kale looked at the open doorway. He walked in. Darius was sitting up. He'd pushed the hospital tray to the side, the one with the file on it, the biometric comparison, the evacuation footage, the transit clearance, so the space between them was clear. He was dressed in the hospital clothes but sitting straight, the way a person sits when they're deciding that gravity is a suggestion rather than a requirement. His eyes tracked Kale all the way across the room. Kale stopped at a reasonable distance. Not too close. Not deferentially far. He held the notebook. Darius looked at him. Really looked. The sustained, unblinking kind of attention that most people find difficult to hold under, the kind that comes from someone who has spent years using presence as leverage. Kale held it. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Darius said, "Careful." The rough voice, "Sit down." Kale pulled the chair. He sat. Darius said, "I know what I know. I want to hear what you say." Kale opened the notebook. He wrote, "What did you find?" Darius said, "Eastern boundary. 6 years ago. You carried me out of the collapse." Kale wrote, "Yes." "You declined documentation." Kale wrote, "Yes." "And you went back in." A pause. Kale looked at the page. Then he wrote, "There was another person inside." Darius said, "Who?" Kale wrote, "One of the security staff. Trapped under debris. Alive." Darius absorbed that. He said, "That's when." He didn't finish the sentence. He just pointed, a small motion toward his own throat, then toward Kale. Kale wrote, "The smoke got worse on the second run. Ceiling section came down. I got the person out. Cost something." Darius looked at those words. He said, "You never came forward." Kale wrote, "No." "Why?" Kale looked at the page for a long moment. He held the pen but didn't write anything. He let the question sit there, which was a thing Kale did. He let questions occupy their full space before he addressed them, like he was making sure they were actually the question being asked. Then he wrote. He turned the notebook around. Darius read it. "You needed a future. I needed quiet." The room was completely still. The monitor tracking. The city outside, visible through the half-open blinds, going about its ordinary business 14 floors below. Darius said, "You disappeared for 6 years." Kale wrote, "I was always somewhere, just not somewhere you could find me. Why come back?" Kale looked at the notebook. Then he wrote something that took a few seconds longer than usual. "Because your sons needed someone who didn't talk. And I happened to be in a lobby." Darius read that. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite something heavier. Something in between that didn't have a clean name. He said, "Zaylin hasn't signed since you left." Kale's hand went still on the notebook. "He stopped the day they took you. Hasn't used a word. Not to me. Not to his brothers." Darius looked at him. "How long have you known sign language?" Kale wrote, "Long time. Did you teach him, or did he already know?" Kale paused. He wrote he already knew some. "We built the rest." Darius said, "I know some. I taught him when he was 4. His mother was partially deaf. He started learning for her." Kale wrote nothing. He looked at Darius. Darius said, "She's gone. 3 years now." Another silence. Different shape. Kale wrote, "I know. He signs about her sometimes. When he thinks no one understands." Darius looked at him. "What does he say?" Kale held the pen. He looked at the notebook. He wrote carefully. "He says she smelled like warm things. He says he's scared he's going to forget the smell." The monitor was very steady. Darius breathed. One careful, controlled breath, the kind you take when something hits you in a place you weren't protecting because you didn't know it needed protecting. He said, "And you told him what?" Kale wrote, "I told him the smell lives in the body, not the memory. Comes back when you're safe." Darius looked at those words for a long time. He said, finally, "What do you want from this?" Kale wrote immediately, "Nothing. From me. Personally." Kale looked at him. Wrote, "Nothing. That's not an answer that belongs to a person who's been carrying something for 6 years." Kale looked at the notebook. He held the pen. He didn't write. Darius said, "Try again." A very long pause. The kind that fills a room. Then Kale wrote. He held the notebook out. "I want the boys to be okay. That's the only thing I've wanted since I sat down on that floor. Everything else is not my business." Darius read it. He read it again. Then he reached to the side of the bed. He picked up the call button. He did not press it. He set it on the tray next to the file with the biometric comparison and the transit clearance and the 6 years of a man who carried someone out of a burning building and asked for nothing in return. He said, "I'm going to tell you something." Kale waited. 6 years ago, I woke up in a transit medical unit with smoke in my lungs and 3 broken ribs and no idea how I got there. The medic told me someone brought me in. Wouldn't leave a name. Left before anyone could. Before I could. He stopped. He tried again. I had people look for 2 years. Couldn't find anything. Kale looked at the window. Darius said, "And then my sons came back from whatever edge they'd gone to and I asked who stayed and I saw footage of a man sitting on a floor with a notebook and 3 children who would not leave his side. And I thought." He stopped. The rough voice had reached a particular limit. Not gone. Still there. But sitting at the edge of something it was not used to approaching. He said, "I thought. I know that quiet." Kale looked at him. Not away. Not at the notebook. At him. And in the quiet of a hospital room on a floor above a city that didn't know any of this was happening. Something that had been held at a careful, managed, precise distance for 6 years very slowly closed. The door opened. Not the main door. The connecting door to the adjacent family room that Marcus had arranged 2 days ago. 3 small figures stood in the doorway. Zion. Zaire. Zaylin, they weren't supposed to be here yet. The nurse who'd been watching them had turned her back for 45 seconds, and that had been, apparently, 45 seconds too many. Zion looked at his father, then at Kale, then back at his father with an expression that said, "I did not come here to be sent away." Zaire was already moving toward Kale. Zaylin stood in the doorway. He looked at Kale. His hands came up, slow, careful, like someone testing the ground before trusting their weight to it. He signed. 2 words. You stayed. Not a question. Not an accusation. Something that lived right between them. Something that 6-year-olds know without having language for it. That presence is a choice, and choosing to be present when it's hard is not the same as staying when it's easy. Kale's hands came up. He signed back. Always. Zaylin crossed the room. He did not climb into Kale's lap. He did not hug him. He stood beside him and pressed his shoulder against Kale's arm, the way he always did, and he looked at his father, and for the first time in 5 days, for the first time since that Tuesday when the paperwork came and the world went sideways, he looked like himself. Darius looked at his son. He looked at the man beside his son. He reached to the tray. He picked up the call button. This time he pressed it. When the nurse came in, she found 3 children distributed around a man in a gray shirt and an alpha king in a hospital bed looking at them all with an expression she didn't have a clinical word for. Darius said, "I need legal. Tonight." She said, "Sir, tonight." She went. And Marcus, standing in the hallway, heard the tone in that one word, and he took out his phone and he started making calls because he had learned in 20 years of working for powerful people that when they used that tone, what came next was not a request. It was a declaration. The legal team arrived at 9 that night. 2 attorneys, a syndicate liaison, and a notary who had been pulled from a dinner reservation and was professional enough not to show it. They arranged themselves near the window of Darius Cade's room, opened their cases, and waited. Darius looked at them. He said, "I'm signing a permanent family guardianship order. Tonight." One attorney said, "Sir, the council's provisional authority," Darius said, "expires the moment I sign any legally binding family document under my own capacity, which I have medically certified as of this afternoon." He looked at the woman. "Do you want to call Dr. Reyes and confirm? Or do you want to start drafting?" She started drafting. The second attorney said, "The council won't be pleased." Darius said, "Then they can come tell me that themselves." Nobody called the council. The document took 2 hours to draft, review, and finalize. Kale sat in the chair in the corner with the notebook in his lap and did not participate in the legal portion of the evening. When the liaison attempted 3 times to ask him questions related to his background disclosure, the unsigned contract, the incomplete file, Kale wrote the same thing each time in the notebook and held it up without looking at the man. "Ask me something different." By midnight, the document was ready. It was 8 pages. Formal. Precise. The kind of language that closes every door of interpretation and leaves only one reading. Permanent guardian, family designation, full access, council override provision that put the appointment under direct alpha authority rather than syndicate committee jurisdiction. And then a second document. This one shorter. Darius drafted this one himself in the rough rebuilt voice, dictating while one attorney typed and the other looked at the ceiling in the careful way of people who have decided not to have opinions about things above their pay grade. It was a policy document. It was addressed to the syndicate's full governing board. It proposed, in clear, unambiguous terms, the creation of an independent caregiver selection protocol. One that removed financial barriers to emergency childcare. One that removed syndicate affiliation requirements for temporary crisis caregivers. One that prioritized behavioral outcomes over background credentials in documented emergency situations. It was 12 paragraphs long. It cited the previous week's events. It cited the $45,000 certified team that had failed in under 4 hours. It cited the behavioral regression that followed the removal order. And in the final paragraph, it cited a principle that Darius dictated slowly and without stopping. A system that cannot protect children from its own administrative processes is not a child protection system. It is a liability management system. We will not operate one of those. The attorney who'd been typing looked at the finished document. She said, "This will be controversial." Darius said, "Good." He signed both documents at 11:47 p.m. The notary stamped them. The legal team packed their cases and left with the professionalism of people who had seen things but would not be discussing them. Marcus was called in at midnight. He read the guardianship order. He read the policy document. He sat down in the chair near the door and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Kale. He said, "You know Devante Sims is going to contest this." Kale wrote, "He'll try." "And the council." Kale wrote, "They'll try too." "You're not concerned." Kale wrote, "He signed it. That's what matters tonight." Marcus looked at the guardianship document on the tray. He said, "It says Cael." Kale looked up. "The document. It lists your name as Cael." Marcus looked at him carefully. "Darius didn't ask you." Kale looked at the document. He looked at Darius, who was watching him from the bed with that steady, unreadable expression that was starting to feel very familiar. Kale wrote, slowly, "Did you ask?" Darius said, "No." Kale wrote, "Is that a problem?" A pause. Darius said, "Is it?" Kale looked at the document for a long moment. He looked at the door to the adjacent room, where the boys were asleep. Where Zaylin had fallen asleep for the first time in 5 days within 30 minutes of coming back into the room, shoulder pressed to Kale's arm. He looked at Darius. He wrote one word, "No." The next morning, Devante Sims walked into a conference room and found Marcus Webb and the guardianship order and the policy proposal and a medical certification of Darius Cade's executive capacity, and he stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides. Then he said, "He moved fast." Marcus said, "He did. The council will review." The council can review. The documents filed. The family designation is already in the system. Marcus put his hands in his pockets. "He's recovering fast, Devante. You should factor that in." Sims picked up the policy proposal. He read the final paragraph. He set it down. He said, "An independent caregiver protocol. Yes, that's going to take 18 months to implement properly." He knows. And in the meantime, the Mute Omega from a rival territory with almost no records is raising 3 alpha heirs. Marcus said, "He's been doing that since last Tuesday. The system just caught up." Devante looked at the document. He said, "This is not how things are done." Marcus said, "No, it isn't." He picked up his coffee. He walked to the door. He said, "It's how they're going to be done." He left. In the family suite 2 floors up, the morning looked like this. Zion was trying to explain to Kale, through a series of increasingly complicated hand motions and one sketch in the notebook that was supposed to be a dog but looked like a cloud, that the beetle from the courtyard might still be alive and might be looking for them. Kale was listening to this with the full, unhurried attention of a man who had decided that the beetle question was the most important item on his agenda. Zaire was at the table eating, not token amounts, an actual breakfast. He'd asked for a second orange juice. Kale had considered this for exactly as long as he'd considered it before. He wrote, "Water." Zaire made the same face Zion had made a week ago. He drank the water. Zaylin was signing. Not to Kale, to his father, who was in the wheelchair they'd brought him in this morning for the first time, positioned near the window so he could be in the room without the bed between him and his sons. Darius's hands were slower, rustier. The sign language of someone who learned it for love and kept it alive but hadn't used it daily. He made a mistake. Zaylin corrected him without pity and with the patient authority of someone who had been doing this much longer. Darius tried again. Zaylin nodded. Something in Darius's face shifted. A small, private adjustment, the kind that only happens when something you thought you'd lost turns out to be somewhere reachable. Kale watched this without appearing to watch. He was good at that. Patrice Osei came by mid-morning. He stood in the doorway looking at the room and then looked at Kale and said, "You replaced a $45,000 system." Kale wrote, "I didn't replace anything. I sat on a floor." Patrice looked at the room. "The boys." Darius. The morning light on the window. He said, That's what I mean. He shook his head, smiling in spite of himself, and walked away. By afternoon, the policy proposal had been formally submitted to the full governing board. By evening, Clarice Beaumont, the child protection liaison who had written the report listing two true things pointing in opposite directions, had called Marcus to say that she was supporting the proposal. She said, "I wrote in my initial report that he was safe for those children." Marcus said, "You also flagged the administrative issues." She said, "I know, and I stand by both. But administrative issues and child safety aren't the same question. We've been treating them like they are for a long time." A pause. "The policy fixes that." Marcus said, "It's going to take 18 months. She said, "Then it takes 18 months. Some things should take time." The evening settled over the floor gently. The boys had dinner in Darius's room. All of them together, a configuration that the nursing staff had decided to simply accommodate rather than redirect, because the alpha had looked at one nurse who suggested moving the children back to the suite and said, with the rough rebuilt voice and the full weight of someone who had been unconscious for 5 days and was done with suggestions, "They stay." They stayed. Kale ate with them. Quietly. Zion narrated most of the meal. The beetle update, a theory about the hospital elevator, a complaint about water being served instead of juice that had apparently reached the level of a philosophical position. Darius listened to all of it. He looked at Zaire finishing his food. He looked at Zaylin signing to Kale about something small and private. He looked at Zion mid-sentence, mid-theory, mid-gesture. He said, quietly, not interrupting, "Thank you." Zion stopped. He looked at his father. "For what?" Darius looked at Kale. Kale had his pen. He was writing in the notebook. He didn't look up. Darius said, "For trusting the right person." Zion thought about this with the serious, full-weight consideration of a 6-year-old evaluating a large idea. Then he said, "We knew. We always knew." Darius said, "How?" Zion looked at Kale. He looked back at his father. "Because he sat down," he said. "And he didn't try to fix anything." Kale kept writing in the notebook. He did not look up. But his hand slowed, and then stopped, and he held the pen very still for a moment, the way a person does when something reaches them in a place they keep carefully covered, and they decide just this once to let it. After the boys were asleep, Zaire with one arm over his face, Zion with a foot pressed against the bed frame, Zaylin with his hands folded on his chest. Kale sat against the wall in the dark and wrote. He wrote for a long time. When he was done, he looked at what he'd written. He tore the page from the notebook. He folded it once. He set it on the tray beside Darius's bed. Then he went back to his chair, and he sat, and he watched the 3 boys breathe in the particular piece of children who know where they are and know someone is there. In the morning, Darius read the page. He read it once. He read it again. Then he reached for the second document. The one not yet filed, the one his attorney had drafted at his request during the midnight session, the one that had not come up yet in any conversation and had been sitting in the file under the guardianship order. He signed it. He called Marcus. Marcus came in, looked at the signed document and went very still. He said, "Is this?" Darius said, "File it." Marcus read the header. Omega Protection Initiative Founding Charter. He read the designated founder line. Founder, Cael. He looked at Darius. Darius said, "He's going to argue." Marcus said, "He's going to write no in large letters and hold it up." Darius said, "I know." A small pause. Something in his voice. Not quite the thing that had been sitting under the surface for 6 years. Not exactly that, but adjacent to it, close enough to feel like movement. "File it anyway." Marcus filed it. Across town, in an office where Devonte Sims was reviewing the policy proposal for the 4th time and building his case for the council review, his assistant put a new document on his desk. He read the header. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the window for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. He did not write an objection. He wrote a single note to the legal team. Let it proceed. And in the hospital suite on a floor above a city that would not know any of this for a long time. Maybe never in the full detail of it, 3 boys slept. And Kale sat. And somewhere in the quiet between the monitor's steady rhythm and the first gray pull of morning light through the window, something settled. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way things settle when they've been in motion a long time and finally find the right place. That's all it takes sometimes. Not a gesture, not a speech, just the right person on the right floor, sitting down, and not leaving. Loyalty that asks for nothing is the only kind power can't buy. And it had been here, patient, quiet, unannounced the whole time.